One of the most confusing parts for defense attorneys and for prosecutors and police officers is the sworn report of the officer. And as I indicated previously, this is where most of the statutory summary suspensions are going to be rescinded of that 7%, dealing with the sworn report of the officer. Keep in mind that when the officer is done with their paperwork and done with their arrest, and prior to releasing the motorist, whether they're in the hospital or whether they're at the station, if there is a breath of 008 or greater or a refusal, the officer must serve that sworn report immediately. On the other hand, if in fact there is a blood, breath, or urine, there's a blood or urine comes back either 008 or positive for something for controlled substances or something illegal, then the officer in fact will mail it. Either way, once that is done, the officer must send the original, what's called a sworn report. And by the way, this report is in triplicate. And as defense attorneys, you need to look in the court file to see what is in there. And the police officers and prosecutors will look at this. It is in triplicate. It is in carbon triplicate. And the sworn report itself actually goes into the court file. And then the law enforcement, serves a copy to the motorist, and they keep a copy. When the sworn report is sent to the Secretary of State is when then the Secretary of State, under 11501.1d, will in fact go to work. As we talked about previously, if in fact there is a problem with the sworn report, and we'll look at some of the sworn reports in a little while where there were problems and they should have been sent back to the court, but they weren't, the Secretary of State under should in fact send those back. They do not enter the 46 days, and it doesn't start. Under 11501.1e, upon receipt of the officer's sworn report, the Secretary of State will enter the suspension period under 6-208.1. Secretary of State will look at the person's driving record, will determine is it a breath or a blood, or is it a refusal, or is it a positive for urine or drugs. And if it is, then they will go ahead and, depending on the motorist's record, will then enter a 6-month suspension or a 12-month suspension. Or if it's a refusal, they will either enter a 12-month suspension, or if the person has had one within 5 years, either a statutory summary suspension and or a DUI, then they will enter the 3-year. Again, under 11500, the motorist is, if they've not had one in 5 years, will be considered a first-timer for purposes only of the statutory summary. All right, what's required on the sworn report? Notice must be given to the motorist by the officer who acts on behalf of the circuit court, advising the motorist of the suspension. The notice must be delivered immediately to the motorist. And the immediate would be giving that at the hospital or at the police department. Officers at the police department, it's a larger police department, and a member of the law enforcement officer's department who is not a sworn police officer, but rather a community service officer. Are they able to give notice to the motorist? Absolutely. Under People v. Lent, L-E-N-T, the service was made by a detention officer who is a civilian employee at Naperville Police Department. The appellate court held this was valid service, defeating the motorist's claim to rescind the suspension. So the motorist gets up on the stand and says, Your Honor, I was not given it to me by the police officer. I was given it to me by a member of a secretary at the police department. Is that valid service? Yes. Now, on the other hand, if the motorist is at the hospital and the motorist says, I never got a copy of the sworn report from the officer, but rather, as I was leaving, the nurse put it in my pocket. Is that proper service? No. At that point, the motorist is going to win based on the fact there was no proper service. It is incumbent in the state of Illinois that the sworn report either be served upon the motorist personally or by mail. And if in fact there's a lack of service of the sworn report, that the officer completely forgets, mails it to the wrong address as we talked about, or under certain circumstances, or is in a hurry, improper or no sworn report service will in fact be a basis for the motorist to have a rescission under People v. Osborne, O-S-B-O-R-N. and until the motorist is either served personally or it is mailed properly to the last known address, no statutory summary suspension, in fact, is even going to be ripe for a hearing. In other words, motorist comes in, they go to their lawyer, and motorist says, well, I want to have a statutory summary suspension hearing, but they drew blood. Since there is no service of sworn report, there is no basis, in fact, to file a petition to rescind. So from the defense perspective, they would not be allowed to file it. From the prosecutor's perspective, if in fact the motorist files it, and you look in your file and you see that there has not been a breath or blood or urine back, and you're waiting for blood results or urine results, file a motion to strike and dismiss the statutory summary suspension, because until there is actual service of the sworn report, the court does not have the authority or the jurisdiction, in fact, to have a hearing.